इमाम मेहदी साहिबुज़्ज़मान अलैहिस्सलाम। अल्लाहुम्मा सल्लि अला मुहम्मदिन व आलि मुहम्मद। बिस्मिल्लाहिर रहमानिर रहीम। अस्सलामु अलैका या हुज्जतल्लाहि फी अर्ज़िहि, अस्सलामु अलैका या ऐनल्लाहि फी खल्क़िहि, अस्सलामु अलैका या नूरल्लाहि अल्लज़ी यहतदी बिहिल मुहतदून व युफ़र्रजु बिही अनिल मुअमिनीन। अस्सलामु अलैका अय्युहल मुहज़्ज़बुल ख़ाइफ़, अस्सलामु अलैका अय्युहल वलियुन नासिह, अस्सलामु अलैका या सफ़ीनतन नजाह, अस्सलामु अलैका या ऐनल हया, अस्सलामु अलैका सल्लल्लाहु अलैका व आलि बैतिका अत्तय्यबीन अत्ताहिरीन, अस्सलामु अलैका अज्जलल्लाहु लका मा वअदका मिनन नस्र व ज़ुहूरिल अम्र, अस्सलामु अलैका या मौलाय अना मौलाका आरिफुन बिउलाका व उखराक, अतक़र्रबु इलल्लाहि तआला बिक व बिआलि बैतिक व अंतज़िरु ज़ुहूरका व ज़ुहूरल हक़्क़ि अला यदैक व अस्अलुल्लाह अन युसल्लि अला मुहम्मदिन व आलि मुहम्मद व अन यजअलनी मिनल मुंतज़िरीन लक वत्ताबिईन वन्नासिरीन लक अला अअदाइक वल्मुस्तशहीदीन बैन यदैक फ़ी जुमलति औलियाइक। या मौलाई या साहिबज़्ज़मान सलवातुल्लाहि अलैका व अला आलि बैतिक, हाज़ा यौमुल जुमअह व हुवा यौमुकल मुतवक्कअउ फ़ीहि ज़ुहूरिक वल फ़रजु फ़ीहि लिल मुअमिनीन अला यदैक व क़त्लुल काफ़िरीन बिसैफ़िक व अना या मौलाय फ़ीहि ज़ैफ़ुक व जारुक व अन्त या मौलाय करीमुन मिन औलादिल किराम व मामूरुन बिज़ियाफ़ति वल इजारा फ़अज़िफ़नी व अजिरनी सलवातुल्लाहि अलैका व अला अहलि बैतिका अत्ताहिरीन। अल्लाहुम्मा सल्लि अला मुहम्मद व आलि मुहम्मद। إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن أمير المؤمنين وإمام المتقين عليا ولي الله أشهد أن أمير المؤمنين وإمام المتقين عليا حجة الله. حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح. حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
أحسنت. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. فوضوا أمري إلى الله إن الله بصير بالعباد. ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل ونعم المولى ونعم النصير. والصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على الرسول المسدد المصطفى الأمجد المحمود الأحمد الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أهل بيت الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين المنتجبين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. اللهم صل على محمد. وقل رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد، قال الله تبارك وتعالى في كتاب الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الله نور السماوات والأرض. صدق الله العلي العظيم. زينوا مجالسكم بالصلوات على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد. My respected elders, brothers and sisters in Iman here in Florida or across the globe, wherever you're hearing my voice, Salamun alaikum and a very Jum'ah Mubarak to you all. At the first level, the question I want to set out is, what are we resolving to do? What is our resolution? As you know, we are embarking on a new year, inshallah, if Allah gives the life. There is a new calendar that's beginning, at least from the calendar that we adopt in our world, that we use day to day. And this is a time for us to reflect. And you will find that this is a moment where people throughout the globe are reflecting on their past year. They're also reflecting on the year to come. And you know that with the new year brings these aspirations, the new year brings these goals, the new year brings these resolutions. Sometimes these goals, sometimes these resolutions are individual. For example, my personal gains and my personal needs. For example, many people make the resolution at this time of year to, for example, work on their diet or work on their health, for example, to lose weight, for example. You find in January of the new year, the gymnasiums are packed. I'm talking about pre-COVID worlds. Or even in people's homes, they're perhaps working out. So health becomes something of interest to the general populace. You find, for example, people say this is going to be the year where I'm going to expand my career, I'm going to expand my business, I'm going to expand X, Y, and Z. And therefore, in the brief moments that we are here together, I want to look at a few things. That is, what is the history of time? What is the history of calendars? What is the history of marking this particular new year? And does it have any relationship to us as Muslims? Does it have anything? Is there anything that we can benefit from? Or are there times where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has designated for us to stop and reflect, to contemplate, where are you going? Where is your ship of life sailing? Is it sailing in the right direction? Is it sailing in the wrong direction? If it's going in the wrong direction, how do I correct course? How do I make sure that I end up going in the proper direction? How can I make that happen? These are questions that come to the forefront in everyone's mind, especially at this time of the year, but throughout the year at large. In the brief moments we have together, I want to look at a few things with you, inshallah. I want to look at what is the history of New Year's and its commemoration on a global level. What is the significance of calendar within other faiths of the world? For example, Judaism and Christianity, what's their narrative? What's the Islamic perspective on this? Has Islam said anything on this? At the fourth level, what is it that we should be doing and what should we be focused on as individuals, as communities, to better ourselves and our societies at large? And finally, what is going on in our world tonight and today throughout the globe, and what should we be thinking about as a society and a community? This is our agenda for the brief moments we are together. Wherever you are, here in Florida or across the globe, send a salawat on Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli. when it comes to the commemoration of the New Year's, according to historians, the first documented evidence that we have of people commemorating and celebrating the New Year's is about 4,000 years ago. The ancient Babylonians, Babylon, which is in modern day Iraq, that is called the cradle of civilization. And that is where the people from Babylon used to commemorate the New Year's, but not the New Year's that we commemorate on the 1st of January. Their New Year's was not based on the solar calendar, which we now follow. Their calendar was based on the lunar calendar, like the Islamic calendar. It was based on the moon. And for them, the day in which they commemorated the New Year is what we call the Spring Equinox. The Spring Equinox used to happen around March 25th every year. And this was also the time, they used to call this Akitu. Akitu was that ceremony which they would celebrate the New Year with. Akitu came from the term of cutting. That was the time where they used to cut barley. And because it symbolized that the spring has come. And when they would celebrate this and commemorate this, the Spring Equinox is the day where the day and the night are exactly even. They're even in terms of their time period. So they would celebrate this at that point in time. And so as time progressed, they used to do this. As time progressed, there then came the Roman Empire. In the Roman Empire, there was an emperor or the ruler by the name of Julius Caesar, which I'm sure you must have heard of the name. In the 46th year before Christ, or 46 BC, it's very important to understand this so that we understand what's going on. Because oftentimes, when you look at, and we'll come to this in a moment, the history of the Judeo-Christian calendar, and where do those dates come from? In any event, when Julius Caesar came forward, he said, look, the time between the solar and lunar calendar, the time has dissipated. This calendar is no longer useful. So he engaged the top astronomers and the top mathematicians to convert the calendar from lunar to solar in the 46th year before Christ. When he came forward and said that we're going to change this to a solar calendar, he came forward and says, how do we name this? So they named the first month January. After what? After Janus, or Janus, Janus. Janus was their god of new beginnings. This was the pagan god of new beginnings that the Roman Empire followed. And it has two heads, one looking back, one looking forward. It symbolized beginning. And that's where this new god came from in their belief system. And therefore, till this day, we mark it as January 1st, based on what was called the Julian calendar, based off the name of Julius Caesar. Eventually, when the Christian church came into power and the Christian church was ruling, they began to say all of these festivals and calendars and these things, they are pagan and they have no religious basis. So they stopped celebrating the New Year's on the 1st, and they said, no, we're going to celebrate it when we determine. So they started celebrating it in March, for example. They started celebrating on Christmas at one point in time. Eventually, Pope Gregory VIII came around. And this is roughly 600 years ago, 550 years ago. When Gregory VIII came around, he said, we're going to adopt the Julian calendar, and we're going to make January 1st once again the beginning of the new year. And this occurred. Now, keep that on the side for one moment. When we come to other faiths and other cultures around the world, you'll find the Chinese calendar. You will find, for example, New Year's in every major religion, for example. Similarly, when we come to the Abrahamic faiths, you will find, for example, in Judaism and Christianity, for example, in the Jewish faith, there's something called Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is considered the start of the Jewish New Year, and it's considered very sacred. It's a time for the Jewish community to reflect, to think, to contemplate on a few things. Spiritual engagement. It's a time for them to do tefillah, which is this idea of prayer, and something that the third thing that they're supposed to do, which is interesting, that has the same Arabic word, because remember they have the same root, they're Semitic languages, is to do sadaqah, which is the term for charity, within Hebrew as well as in Arabic. So they are told that at the beginning of the year we're supposed to do this. Spiritual enlightenment, prayer, and charity. It's part and parcel of the faith. As time progressed, you would find, for example, one other element that we should consider is the lining up of calendars and how important this is. For example, we're in the year 2021 at the moment, and we're about to be in 2022. But again, oftentimes, if we don't think and we don't learn from the pages of history, you end up starting to think and not realizing certain things. For example, what? When was this world created as per the biblical narrative? Because this question emerges in the minds of many youngsters and others alike. that if you look at the timeline of God and you look at the timeline of science, they don't seem to match up. Because the question emerges, well, how long ago did Jesus live? How long ago did Rasulullah live? So Rasulullah, we often say 1400 years ago or so. How long ago did Jesus live? According to what you would say 2021 years ago, about to be 2022. By the way, a side note, according to most biblical scholars, interestingly enough, Jesus was not born, the calendar we have, it does not coincide with the birth. It's 4 years off. In fact, most Christian scholars say that Jesus was actually born in the 4th year. It baffles the mind. So there's an off element by 4 years, where Jesus would have been born 4 years. So you can do the difference there. So anyways, keeping that to aside, when we come to the Judaic narrative, they say that their calendar starts roughly 4,000 years before what the Christians call the birth of Jesus. Now why is this important? Because many young people ask, hold on a second, Rasulullah 1400 years ago, Jesus 2000 years ago, how long ago was Moses? Let's say 5,000 years ago. How long ago was Nuh alayhi salam? Let's say 7,000 years ago. Let's go maximum, how long was Adam alayhi salam? Maximum according to the Islamic narrative. One would say maybe 15,000 years ago. Let's stretch it to the limit, 20,000 years. Well, then they would argue that, hold on a second, that doesn't align with the narrative of science, because science says we've had human beings, this planet, for 4 billion years plus, and we've had human beings for hundreds of thousands of years before that. What's the answer? And there is an answer, which I'll give to you in a moment. And it's very important that you and I know this, because otherwise, if we don't know this, then we start having doubts about Islam at large. But let's go with the Jewish narrative. In the calendar within the Jewish belief, the calendar starts with the creation of this universe. That is, they have AM. You know how we have BC, for example, in our modern world before Christ? They have AN. Anno Mundi. Anno Mundi means the year of the world. That's when the world was created. According to the calendar that we have the Hijra calendar. In the Judaic faith, they have a calendar which is currently in the year 5782. This is when the world was created according to that narrative. So the first was creation. Then after about 1,656 years happened the flood. You know how we're talking about in the Thursday night series, we're talking about Amul Fil, for example, that is the year of the elephant. These markers of what happened in years in society, similarly, these are big markers in the Judeo-Christian narrative. That is the creation of the world, 5,782 years ago. Then the flood happened, 1,656 years after that. Then after that, they say for 290 years, then was the era of Nuh. Then came the birth of Ibrahim. Abraham's birth led to his son, because he had the son at the age of 100, and then his son Ismail, or Ishaq in the Jewish narrative, and then his lineage. They say that's another 290-year period. And then you continue on another 400-year period, where there's the Exodus that occurs, and then you continue on, the first temple is built, and then you continue on, which was another 400-year period, and then there's a 70-year exile period, and then there is another 400 years where the second temple is built. Why am I saying this? If you look at the Jewish narrative, the Christian narrative, and the Islamic narrative, on literal perspectives, many people would say this is a problem with science, because it doesn't add up. But if you look at the details, you'll begin to realize certain things. By the way, there's something called Christian literalists. Christian literalists, like Islamic literalists, take literal interpretations. We were just talking about this at the Fajr breakfast program, that many people who try to call Shias or others, minorities in the Muslim world, as non-adherents or people who are misguided, oftentimes they try to take a literalist perspective of the Quran. The same way they try to take a literalist perspective of the Bible. What do literalists do? They try to say that whatever is written, that is exactly what is meant by face value. And this was answered by Ayatollah Hakim, for example, when he went to Mecca. And at that point in time, when he went to Mecca, he had an encounter with someone who was a literalist interpreter of the Quran. And he was blind, they say. And because he was blind, they entered into the library. When he was in the library, at that point in time, he heard this literalist interpreter, we may even say Wahhabi interpreter of the Quran, came forward and said, "Who's entered into my library?" They said, "One of the Rafidis have entered," or the Rafidis have entered. Rafidi meaning rejectors, the one who reject the first three Khulafa. So he says, "The rejectors have entered." He said, "Okay. Tell them to leave the library." Why should they leave the library? They should leave the library because they interpret the Quran. They don't take the literal meaning. At that point in time, we're told that Sayyid Hakim was ready to leave, but there were some people perhaps there who said, why don't you respond to him? Why don't you tell him that he's wrong? And why don't you... At that point he says, perhaps, okay. He says, you take a literalist perspective of the Quran. Very well. He said, yes, you have to take everything as it's written, letter by letter. You cannot interpret anything. He says, very well. He said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran says, وَمَنْ كَانَ فِي هَذِهِ أَعْمَى فَهُوَ فِي الْآخِرِ أَعْمَى. Whoever is blind in this world will be blind in the hereafter. He said, no, this means blindness of the heart. He said, hold on, the verse never said heart. You said heart, you added heart, you interpreted the verse. Therefore, when those people who come forward in our modern world, the likes of these terrorist organizations, and say, then they take verses out of context, this has been happening in Christianity and Judaism, and it continues to happen in Islam. People misuse scripture. They misuse the books of God in order to gain their own political, socio-economic gains. So it's important for us to understand these elements of the equation. So coming back, Christian literalists believe that literally whatever is written in the Bible verbatim is exactly how it is. Why is this important to know? Because in the Christian narrative, you will find certain people that they completely reject science today because they say it doesn't align with the Bible. We as followers of Islam are not to be antagonistic towards science. We are not opponents of science. Remember, science, the capital of civilization, the capital of science for 300 years, from 800 to 1100 AD, was Baghdad, under Muslim rule. That's where mathematics came from, that's where algebra came from, that's where Kitab al-Jabr wal-Maqabil, the first book on mathematics, came from. In fact, algorithm that Google runs on and the world runs on today, algorithm is literally a Latinization of Khwarizmi. And we need to know this because I'm answering the question that I asked a few moments ago, which was, many people say the timelines don't add up. If you ask this question on the surface level, it's a great question, but we must answer it to the satisfaction of the minds of the young who are asking this question. What's the answer? The answer comes from a hadith that we have from the Ahlul Bayt. Amir al-Mu'min Imam Ali was asked, for example, were there any creations before Adam? First question, before our Adam. Was there any creation? Number one. Number two, we have a narration from Imam Baqir that was asked, was there a world before our world or not? These two traditions I want to make very clear for you, inshallah. Imam Baqir says, yes, not only were there worlds before our worlds, there were Adams before our Adams. The narration says there were alf. Alf means 1,000. At that time, they did not have the counting of million at that time. Today, million is a modern, million in the Arabic language, alaykum salam, is a very modern dynamic. Before that, they didn't have this concept. So what ended up happening was he said, alf. Imam al-Baqir says, we had 1,000 worlds before, so a million worlds before our world. And each one of them has its own Adam. Each one of it had their own Adam. First tradition. Second tradition. Amir al-Mu'min was asked, was there any creation before Adam? At that point in time, the Imam is attributed to have said, yes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He first created the nur, the light of the Ahlul Bayt. And then He created the jinns. And then He created the angels. And then He created a creation called Nasnas. He said, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, we understand the light. We understand the light of the Ahlul Bayt. We understand jinns. We understand angels. But what do you mean? Nasnas, what is it? Amir al-Mu'mineen explained. They asked at that time as well. Amir al-Mu'mineen explained. He said, they were creations that looked like us, physically perhaps, but they were not endowed with intellect, aql. Allah had not given them that. Perhaps analogous to what we would call cavemen, for example, in our modern terminology. So putting these two traditions together, you begin to realize our Adam is not necessarily the same Adam that is the first of creation or the first Neanderthal, for example, that we have. For example, if you look at the scientific names, we have sapiens, for example, Homo sapiens, we have Homo erectus, and before that the different genus of creation. I'm saying this, in fact you will find this 20,000 year period in fact aligns with the end of the Ice Age, or the most recent Ice Age. I'm saying this so that you have confidence in your belief system that the Ahlul Bayt at that time were looking way down the road. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as the creator and the Lord of this world, had created a book and a system that is not devoid and not out of funked and not out of rhythm with our modern world. The answers are there, my young ones. The answers are there, but we need to make sure we take the time in order to understand these things so that we can actually have a better world. Understand these timelines and understand how we can use them to make our world a better place. Inshallah, in the next khutbah, we will get to the main essence. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim wal asr. Inna al-insana lafi khusr. Illa alladhina amanu wa amilu salihat. Wa tawasaw bil haqqi wa tawasaw bis sabr. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين فاطر السماوات والأرضين والصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على الرسول المسدد المصطفى الأمجد المحمود الأحمد الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وعلى علي أمير المؤمنين وعلى فاطمة الزهراء سيدة النساء العالمين وعلى حسن المجتبى والحسين الشهيد بكربلاء وعلى علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي والخلف الهادي المهدي حججك على عبادك وأمنائك في بلادك صلاة كثيرة دائمة صلوا على محمد وآل محمد اللهم صل على محمد. My respected elders, brothers and sisters in Iman here in Florida, across the globe, in the second khutbah, a very Jummah Mubarak to you, and Salamun Alaikum Jameel wa Rahmatullahi wa Barakatuh. Very succinctly in the second khutbah, we mentioned that today marks the end of the year, and we mark the beginning of the new calendar, inshallah, and it's a time for us to draw resolutions. And as we're beginning the new year, we cannot neglect and we cannot forget the families, those impacted today in Colorado and what's going on there, the wildfires that have caught ablaze, and they are impacting tremendous lives, so they are in our thoughts and our prayers, and we should help them in whatever way that we can at the first level. At the second level, when we come to our world, this is a time for us to come with resolutions. Oftentimes people come with them, and it's a beautiful thing. It's a time for us to reflect. People come with resolutions about their health, which is wonderful. People come with resolutions about their weight, for example, their businesses and their finance and other aspects. It's wonderful. But I want to discuss a couple of things very quickly in the second khutbah about how can you actually stick to your resolutions. What does the science say, number one? And number two, what is it with respect to spiritual goals? Do we have any? And if so, what are they? What should our spiritual goals be? And how can they help us in our lives? Oftentimes, material goals are good, but if we limit it just to that, we may be missing a much bigger opportunity. At the first level, many times people make grand goals at the beginning of the year in terms of their weight and, for example, their businesses and things of this nature, or their lifestyle changes. These are good, but according to the science, if you actually wanted to stick, if you actually wanted to stay, they actually say perhaps consider the opposite. Perhaps consider starting smaller and consistently and scale that. And that's really what's important. So for example, if you're saying that I'm going to run a marathon, I'm going to run, for example, 26 miles, 27 miles, and you say that I'm going to do this overnight, oftentimes you will lose a lot of that motivation within the first few weeks because it's such an audacious goal. So you have to break that down into pieces. You say, look, I'm going to run a marathon, but not overnight. You say by maybe the end of the year, for example. So you start with 2 minutes. And you say, I'm going to run 2 minutes, because your mind says, okay, I can do 2 minutes. So you run those 2 minutes. Then the next week you make it 4 minutes, then 6 minutes, then 8 minutes. And eventually you build up. The most important element of the equation is to have that consistency. The similar with, for example, the weight and all those other elements that you may be looking at in life. Those are very vital to consider. Start small, but be consistent. That's why, according to researchers, January, the gymnasiums are packed. Come March, there's hardly anyone there. Because it only lasts for a certain time. That boost is very vital. Having a bigger picture and a consistent plan. So what works? Being confident is important, but what works according to researchers is, number one, having a plan. Having a schedule, removing any distractions that you may have, and rewarding your successes. This is vital. Now coming to this, what about for us as Muslims? Oftentimes, we end up putting on the back burner what are our goals. I remind you, the studies that were done, for example, at Notre Dame University and other researchers that came forward and did the largest study of young people and religion in America. What did they find? Because I'm looking at the trajectory 3 to 5 years down the road. They found a few things that are noteworthy. The researchers, they studied over 2,000 practicing young people of faith in America. What did they find? They found that number one, for most of them, religion was not a priority. It was not the main thing on their list. They found, for example, that they were not able to speak at depth about their religion. For example, they said, you believe in God? Yeah, I believe in God. What do you believe about God? That would be akin to someone say, for example, do you know the Usuluddin? Okay, yeah, what are they? Tawheed, Adalat, Nabuwwat, Imamat, Qiyamat. Okay, what does it mean? That's when people got stuck. That was the second finding. And the third finding, according to the researchers, was that young people in America, they follow a very different religion than their parents. They follow something called moralistic therapeutic deism. Moralistic therapeutic deism meaning what? That it's deism, I believe in a God versus not believing in a God, but it's therapeutic in the sense that it's a God on demand. God's there when I need Him, but when I don't need Him, He's on the back burner. And this is one thing that we're facing. What the researchers also concluded was the point that I mentioned earlier, that religion is not a priority for young Americans. That means that the first thing that there may be on their list is school, work, social life, X, Y, and Z. Way down the list, if it's on the list, is religion. What that means for you and I is we need to prioritize and make time for religion. So what are some resolutions you can make on that front? One resolution you can make is, for example, Quran daily. It doesn't have to be a huge chapter. It doesn't have to be at length. It could be one verse or even a part of a verse to reflect on it. We often forget. We focus so much on the namaz, roza. It's very important, no doubt. However, we forget that over 700 verses of the Quran refer to tafakkur and tadabbur, reflection and contemplation on this universe. Is that not worship? Is that not ibadah? What about that verse? What about that prophetic tradition that said, tafakkaru sa'a? The contemplation of 1 hour is better than what? 70 years of worship. 70 years. You may ask, you and I, we may have our priorities wrong. We should be focusing predominantly on tafakkur and tadabbur, reflection, contemplation. And everything else should be secondary. Why? This amazing book that Allah has given, that has all the answers to all those questions that you have in your heart and mind. But we don't use it. We often let it collect dust. Make that a priority, number one. Number two, Nahjul Balagha. Now, you may say the Quran is not as accessible in terms of understanding the meaning. I needed some help. Nahjul Balagha, you may find, is much more accessible in terms of understanding. Just go to the back, open the page at the end, and look at some of the traditions. What are the sayings of Amir al-Mu'mineen? Maybe that can give you some guidance in your life. One of the biggest things, according to sociologists and philosophers in the last 200 years, we've lost meaning. And one of the reasons we've lost meaning is because religion used to answer the big questions that people had in life. Why am I here? What's my purpose? What am I supposed to do with my life? But as religions declined, people don't have good answers to these questions anymore. So they're floating around trying to find these answers, and sometimes you spend your whole life. But from the narrative of the Quran, the Ahlul Bayt, you and I have good answers to these things. We just have to do some investigation. Sayfa Sajadiyah, spirituality. People are craving spirituality in our world. How do you get that? What's your spiritual resolution? How are you supposed to get about that? What's your plan for that? Make all your plans for your health. Make your plans for your happiness. Make your plans for your wealth. I'm not stopping you, I'm encouraging you. However, don't forget to make a plan for yourself, for your family, in your spiritual development, because that is where tranquility will come from. As the Quran says, Ala bi dhikrillahi tatma'inna al-qulub. Verily, in the remembrance of Allah do the hearts find solace and peace and tranquility. We live in a world where people are starving for this solace. People are taking their lives because they're not finding this solace. You and I need to make that a priority in our lives so that our children and our next generations have that tranquility and can tap into it to feel a sense. That's one level, the individual and the family. But beyond that, as a final point, resolutions are not only individualistic. Resolutions also go to the community level, they go to the society level, and they go beyond. What world do we want to see in 2022 and beyond? What world do we want to see? Do we want to see a world that's more equitable, more fair, more egalitarian? A world that people are richer, the richer get richer, or the poor get poorer? Or do we want to try to actually make the world where there's a bit more equality? Where the world everyone has. We are told that in the 4 years, 9 months that Amir al-Mu'mineen ruled in Kufa, from Kufa, the entire Muslim dominion from there, towards the end of that, right before he was assassinated, people weren't the richest, people weren't driving the best cars. However, he accomplished something that perhaps we have not even accomplished today yet. And that is that he accomplished that nobody went to sleep hungry. That's a huge accomplishment. We cannot say that in 2021 and 2022 in our own backyards in the United States of America. I was just in San Francisco. I was flabbergasted by the level of poverty in the city. I drove 20 minutes in San Francisco and I saw 3 homeless people in one block. Next block was the same thing. In a place where you have multi-billionaires. What are we doing about America? Because what we do in America scales to our world globally. I'm not saying don't get rich. I'm not saying don't work hard. I'm not saying don't be successful. However, don't forget there's other human beings in the world. We need to make sure we don't lose our humanity. It seems as a society we may be doing that. Those are things that we would like to reflect on, inshallah, for 22. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless this gathering. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us and our families to prosper in this new year in all aspects of life, in our iman, in our health, and our wealth. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make this a better world and allow us to enable that to happen. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, anyone who's suffering from COVID or otherwise, Ya Allah, alleviate their suffering. Ya Allah, anyone who's suffering from any financial difficulty, Ya Allah, alleviate their suffering. And Ya Allah, hasten the reappearance of Imam Sahib alayhi zaman and allow us to be amongst his companions when he returns. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wal Asr. Innal insana lafi khusr. Illa alladhina amanu wa amilu salihat. Wa tawasaw bil haqqi wa tawasaw bis sabr. Thank you so much. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله أشهد أن علي ولي الله أشهد أن عليا حجة الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير الأمل حي على خير الأمل قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله صلاة الجمعة إن الصلاة ونسقي ومحياي ومماتي لله رب العالمين وجهت وجه الذي فطر السماوات والأرض حنيفا الله أكبر
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يسبح لله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض الملك القدوس العزيز الحكيم. هو الذي بعث في الأميين رسولا منهم يتلو عليهم آياته ويزكيهم ويعلمهم الكتاب والحكمة وإن كانوا من قبل لفي ضلال مبين وآخرين منهم لما يلحقوا بهم وهو العزيز الحكيم. ذلك فضل الله يؤتيه من يشاء والله ذو الفضل العظيم. مثل الذين هم من التوراة ثم لم يحملوها كمثل الحمار يحمل أسفارا بئس مثل القوم الذين كذبوا بآيات الله والله لا يهدي القوم الظالمين. قل يا أيها الذين هادوا إن زعمتم أنكم أولياء لله من دون الناس فتمنوا الموت إن كنتم صادقين ولا يتمنونه أبدا بما قدمت أيديهم والله عليم بالظالمين. قل إن الموت الذي تفرون منه فإنه ملاقيكم ثم تردون إلى عالم الغيب والشهادة فأنبئكم بما كنتم تعملون. يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا نودي للصلاة من يوم الجمعة فاسعوا إلى ذكر الله وذروا البيع ذلكم خير لكم إن كنتم تعلمون. فإذا قضيت الصلاة فانتشروا في الأرض وابتغوا من فضل الله واذكروا الله كثيرا لعلكم تفلحون. وإذا رأوا تجارة أو لهوا انفضوا إليها وتركوك قائمة قل ما عند الله خير من اللهو ومن التجارة والله خير الرازقين. الله أكبر. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد وأرقى وأسجد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. سمع الله لمن حمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. يا لطيف ارحم عبدك الضعيف. الله أكبر. الحمد لله وخير الأسماء لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم عرفني نفسك فإنك إن لم تعرفني نفسك لم أعرف نبيك. اللهم عرفني رسولك فإنك إن لم تعرفني رسولك لم أعرف حجتك. اللهم عرفني حجتك فإنك إن لم تعرفني حجتك ضللت عن ديني.
أحسنت. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. أشهد أن علي ولي الله. أشهد أن عليا حجة الله. حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل. قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. صلاتي ونسقي ومحياي ومماتي لله رب العالمين. إني وجهت وجه الذي فطر السماوات والأرض حنيفا مسلما. الله أكبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد وأرقى وأسجد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. كذلك الله ربي. الله أكبر. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. الحمد لله وخير الأسماء لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد وأرقى وأسجد. سبحان الله ولا إله. سبحان الله سبحان الله. استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد وأرقى وأسجد. سبحان الله سبحان الله الحمد لله استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. يا لطيف ارحم عبدك الضعيف. الله أكبر. الحمد لله وخير الأسماء لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. لا إله إلا الله إلها واحدا ونحن له مسلمون. لا إله إلا الله ولا نعبد إلا إياه مخلصين له الدين ولو كره المشركون. لا إله إلا الله ربنا ورب آبائنا الأولين. لا إله إلا الله وحده وحده أنجز وعدا ونصر عبدا وأزدى جندا وأزم الأحزاب وحدا. فله الملك وله الحمد يحيي ويميت ويحيي وهو حي لا يموت بيده الخير وهو على كل شيء قدير. السلام عليك يا رسول الله. السلام عليك يا أمير المؤمنين. السلام عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء سيدتي نساء العالمين. السلام عليك يا حسن المجتبى السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك عليك مني جميعا سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار ولا جعل الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. السلام عليك يا علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي. السلام عليك يا مولاي، السلام عليك يا صاحب العصر والزمان، السلام عليك يا خليفة الرحمن، السلام عليك يا شريك القرآن، السلام عليك يا كعبة الإيمان، السلام عليك يا إمامنا وإمام الإنس والجان. أجل الله تعالى مخرجك وظهورك وجعلنا من أنصارك جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. اللهم كن لوليك صلواتك في هذه الساعة وليا وقائدا ودليلا تسكنه وتمتعه فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين.